Hello everyone, this is Menz here. I'm going to be breaking down the Strv 103b's armor here in this video. There's also a full weak spot guide article on my website watguru.com in the video description below and also at the end of the video. But looking at this tank's armor, so essentially breaking it down, the tank relies heavily upon angles. Pretty much the entire frontal slope is at an auto bounce angle, as well as the lower Glazes too. So while it isn't the thickest armor, it will bounce your shots just based off of the angle of impact, essentially. If you're close to it, you can shoot down to it and actually penetrate very easily, but most ranges, you're going to be shooting at an auto bounce angle. So a lot of times, if you're shooting AP, APCR, if you can't overmatch the actual armor, then you're just going to bounce off of it. Unless you're throwing like a high explosive shell or a heat shell that doesn't auto bounce off of it. But the tier 10 Strv 103b compared to the tier 9, it adds this space armor, essentially anti-heat grill on the front, and also the lower Glazes is space armor. So starting at the bottom of the tank here, the lower Glazes has space armor that's 30 millimeters thick. It's anywhere from 17 degrees to 67 degrees, depending on where you hit it. And the entire thing doesn't actually have any hull armor behind it. Only this yellow area does. Now, 122 millimeter and higher guns actually overmatch this area because there is that 40 millimeters of armor behind the space armor that, 100, basically 91 millimeter up guns can overmatch that. However, you won't actually overmatch the hull behind it, so it doesn't matter. But looking at this, it sits between 160 and 206 millimeters effective. That doesn't take into account normalization of AP and APCR shells, so they'll be a little bit lower, actually needing to penetrate that. So heat shells hitting this area, one thing to keep in mind, you still can pen this with heat if you hit it in a basically higher up here area, because there's not a huge gap between the space armor kind of sitting like this and the hull, but the lower down you hit, the more space and heat's not going to be able to penetrate it. So basically if you hit it, more or less from these little clips up in the center here, you can penetrate with heat. If you have AP and APCR though, you're going to struggle to pen if you can't overmatch it. Say you have a 120 millimeter caliber gun until they change the overmatch rules, and in that case you're going to be looking at the effective armor values basically over here, to where it will be easier to penetrate. Just above this area though, there's an exposed lower Glazes strip here and also the exposed upper Glazes strip. The lower Glazes 72 degrees and the upper Glazes 79 degrees. So the difference between that, 129 millimeters effective for the lower Glazes little strip and 210 for the upper Glazes, and you're still going to bounce off of it if you're not close up shooting down, say up into the upper Glazes, if you don't negate that angle. If you have a 120 millimeter gun, something like that, you're still going to bounce off of it unless you're using heat, HE. But oftentimes if you can hit this area, if you're hitting the lower Glazes, it's easier, to take that angle off and penetrate. But at the same time, it's very risky because it's such a small little area here. Essentially, you can see the bottom of it's essentially right at the top of these clips. It's not the easiest spot to hit, but it is there in the actual armor model. But actually hitting it is very difficult. But it is a weak spot. Technically, it's just more often than not, you're better just kind of bum rushing the Strv 103b, getting around to its side, or basically shooting down into its upper hull and basically negating the auto bounce angle. But anyway, moving higher up here, so the upper Glazes 40 millimeters thick in a couple areas just at the beginning of the upper Glazes here, just beneath the gun, so any yellow spot that you see on the upper Glazes, and just above the gun. So this center area here, you actually don't hit any space armor above the gun, so firing heat there, or if you can overmatch the 40 millimeters with 122 plus millimeter gun, you're going to be able to penetrate this area pretty easily. It's 220 millimeters effective, but if you overmatch it, it's pretty much butter cutting through it. Now, once you get into the orange areas of the upper glacis, they bump up to 50 millimeters. So only 152 millimeter plus guns now overmatch that, and it's 272 millimeters effective because you're hitting the heat shield, like the little grate on the front, plus the upper hull. So this area is, just above that 40 millimeter strip on the upper glacis, and also the upper left and right cheeks, essentially, of the upper glacis. So it kind of throws a wrench into your plans. Some higher caliber TD guns and stuff can penetrate this area by overmatching it with, say, AP, APCR shells, but heat will still, I'm going to get to that in a second view here. It's going to struggle going through the anti-heat shield plus penetrating the hull armor if you hit this heat shield very high up. Low down here is better off if you're hitting heat and you're not able to, say, thread the needle in between the heat shield above the gun. And then finally, there's a 60 millimeter thick spot of the upper hull here. It's 324 millimeters effective. 183 plus millimeters can overmatch it. So not many guns can, but it's just something where, honestly, if you're not comfortable with, say, hitting these yellow bits, or if you have a high caliber gun, being able to hit, the upper left and right cheeks, hitting down in this area can be very iffy. It's just the armor is essentially the definition of being trolly is all fucking hell. Excuse my language, because it's just true. This armor, it just trolls the hell out of you. And basically, the only reliable, consistent weak spot that is very hard to hit at long range is the commander's cupola. It's 20 millimeters to 30 millimeters thick, and pretty much everything auto penetrates it, overmatches it, destroys it if you hit it in the commander's cupola. It's very small. It's just under, if you see you can kind of see here, right below this little cursor, is that viewport. You want to aim just below that, because the viewport actually isn't part of the model, and you hit the commander's cupola. That's really the best hope you have, but more or less, say you're shooting at this in a 120 millimeter gun, or below, really your main chance is hitting the commander's cupola or the very small strip of unexposed, basically the exposed part with no space armor over it, in between the upper and lower glacis. But actually hitting that's hard, so at times just try to throw HE if you can't hit the commander's cupola. Once you get to 122 millimeter plus gun, you can start hitting the lower glacis with AP, APCR, and you can also hit above the gun, below the gun. And then 155 millimeter plus, you're able to basically, 152 millimeter plus guns, you're able to hit the lower glacis, the yellow, orange areas, pretty much most of the tank outside of the red spots. And one caveat is if you use heat rounds, no matter if you're a 120 millimeter caliber gun, something like that, you technically can pen the very upper part of this lower glacis because the space in between it and the hole behind it isn't much. Same thing goes with the upper glacis here, but it's still pretty risky. Anyway, moving on here. I know it's very confusing, but the article on Wakuru can be a little bit more reliable since it's a little bit easier to explain things there. But anyway, moving on to the next view here, just kind of goes into the space armor that you're going to be running into. So you have the anti-heat grill on the upper part here, that's 10 millimeters thick. The anti-heat grill on the bottom, that's 30 millimeters thick, and more or less the only exposed areas are outlined here. So throwing heat is definitely something where you want to avoid the areas that aren't exposed. So essentially you want to avoid these areas because there's also this little exposed area here, but oftentimes you hit the gun. So it's pretty difficult to land and thread a shot. So oftentimes it's better just to rush in, kill it, rush around and flank it, that's mainly its weakness. Hell, you can even rush into them and ram them and flip them over. But finally, getting to this view here. Hopefully I can set this up pretty easily. Let's see. Right about there. So this is what I'm trying to explain about the heat shells. As far as it only takes into account the upper glacis here, because it would get pretty a little bit too complicated taking into account the lower glacis, but I'll also mention that once I pull this off. So once you hit this initial space armor front, it's approximated here, because everything's kind of angled, but once you hit the initial space armor front, right here, the yellow, orange, red lines, they essentially had the effective armor value here. But hitting this, the way heat shells work, essentially for the amount of distance a heat shell is going to travel, you lose basically a set rate of penetration for the amount of distance it travels. So I kind of approximated and measured out the distance hitting this first spaced armor plate and going back to essentially the end of the upper glacis before the commander's cupola over here. So as you can see, this 40 millimeter armor strip here in the front, you're going to lose about 10%, possibly 20% of your heat shell penetration going from the space armor front and actually hitting the hull. So that's where you still technically can pen it even with heat. It's not a surefire thing, but it is possible. But once you get to the 50 millimeter armor section, you're going to lose about 20-30% of your heat shell. So there's not too many heat shells that you can guarantee to penetrate 272 millimeters effective after losing 20-30% of their penetration plus whatever RNG throws at you. So that's why it can be very difficult, because once you get into 60 millimeters, you're losing anywhere from, say, as you can see here, like 30, 40, 50% of your heat shell. So it gets pretty much impossible as you go up. And at this point, you're losing 100% if you hit this space armor and travel through to try to hit the upper glacis. Now, if for whatever reason you can get close up and shoot down into the tank, so pulling this little image off here, say you can get close enough to where your shell travels and just misses it and hits it, you're golden. You're not going to auto bounce because you're shooting down and it's going to be below 70 degrees. Heat shell, AP, APCR, it makes it easier. But actually hitting the space armor plate, you're going to lose a lot of penetration with heat shells, to where you're not going to have enough penetration unless, pulling this up again, you pretty much stick to just hitting the front little bit here. That's really your only hope, unless you miss the space armor and you pretty much hit in between, right above the gun, something like that. And with the lower plate, you can kind of see the space armor outlined here. There is that little bit of a gap to where there's not much space armor in this. I'll get it a little bit better. So essentially, the area that I'm kind of mentioning is essentially right here. There's no space armor on the front of the Strv 103b as far as how it's modeled. It's a very small strip and it's very hard to hit, but it is there. But hitting a heat shell towards this area here on the upper or the lower glacis, it can give you a shot to actually penetrate it. And the further down you go, it's definitely going to be harder to actually penetrate it because the distance between the space armor and the hull is very, very large. So your best bet, is not to hit the space armor in the first place, but it does open up some possibilities if you know where you can and can't penetrate, even with, say, heat. And it's kind of like a clusterfuck, essentially, until they change the overmatch rules. Because right now it largely depends on if your gun's 122 millimeters and up, 155 millimeters and stuff, and it really hurts 120 millimeter and under caliber guns. But for the most part, the Strv 103b, that's the frontal armor. Once you get around to the side, the rear, it has literally no armor to it. You're just going to be able to penetrate it. It can't shoot at you. It can't get away from you. You hell, I've done it plenty of times in tanks that aren't very high off the ground. You can ram these things and flip them over because you get under their essentially upper glacis and you flip them over. But anyway, hopefully this helped you out a little bit. It is very confusing. Hell, I'm confused about the Strv 103b when I shoot at it most times. But between this video and also the article that goes into more in-depth kind of analysis of its armor over on my website, there's a link in the video description below here and also popping up here since it's the end of the video. Feel free to check it out because this tank is pretty menacing to basically come across on the battlefield, and it can be pretty, sometimes virtually impossible to penetrate from the front reliably. But anyway, hopefully it's helped you out. Thanks for watching. Have a very nice day, and hopefully check out another one of my videos sometime soon. See you around.